Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Sam Keene, Professor of Electrical Engineering at the Cooper Union. Tonight's event aims to raise awareness about some of the growing threats to journalists on online platforms, the impact that has on journalism, and what can we do to mitigate the dangers to journalists while protecting press freedom. Before we begin, I'd just like to note that you can post your questions using the Q&A button in the bottom right of your screen, and we'll get to those later in the program. Tonight's guests are Dr. Courtney Radsch of the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization founded in 1981 to monitor threats to press freedom by documenting dangers faced by journalists all over the world. The group's work helps protect not only journalists themselves, but also safeguards the quality and reliability of the news we receive. Dr. Radsch is CPJ's Advocacy Director and the author of Cyberactivism and Citizen Journalism, Egypt, Digital Dissidence and Political Change. As a veteran journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate, she writes and speaks frequently about the intersection of media, technology, and human rights. We're also joined by Daniel Kahn Gilmore, a senior staff technologist for ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, focused on the way our technical infrastructure shapes society and impacts civil liberties. As a free software developer and member of the Debian project, he contributes to fundamental tools that shape the possibilities of an information-rich environment. As a participant in the Internet Engineering Task Force, he fosters the creation of new generations of networking and cryptographic protocols designed and optimized for privacy and security. He is an anti-surveillance advocate for privacy, justice, freedom, and data sovereignty. I'm also happy to introduce my colleague Ben Aranda, a professor of architecture here at Cooper Union and principal at Aranda Lash, an architecture and design studio in New York and Tucson that designs buildings, installations, and furniture through deep investigations of structure and materials. The firm has received recognition with myriad design awards, international exhibitions and galleries, museums, design fairs, and biennials. Their work is part of the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Ben and I work with tonight's fourth guest, Nithi Subayan. She graduated from the Cooper Union in May with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and is currently earning her master's degree at Cooper. She is also a Civic Digital Fellow of the General Services Administration. Nithi, Ben, and I have particular interest in tonight's topic because last year we worked together on a project called Hiding from the Eyes of the City, which I'll bring up right now. My computer is slow for some reason. There we go. There we go. Hiding from the eyes of a city. This is a surveillance technology and how it might be avoided. This project was exhibited in the 2019 by Shenzhen Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture. This was part of a series of interdisciplinary classes meant to motivate students to wrestle with ethical questions in their field. Our course was designed to help students discover the long-term implications of software that can identify and track individuals' movements. Students developed a facial recognition system that assigned IDs to individuals. Once that information was inputted into the system, we explored attacks on that system. So you see here, one of our students recording her face with the system. Once that information was inputted, we explored attacks using our attacks, used stickers, face paint, or other patterns to confuse the system such that it rendered them anonymous. And the system was not able to identify the users. When it came time to install this project, the Chinese Cultural Bureau in Shenzhen rejected it, although we never received an official explanation why. However, the biennial's curators found a way around that prohibition, and they asked us to collaborate on a set of information kiosks at the biennial's entrance. Working remotely with the curators and their technical team, we worked to make the facial recognition system and the opportunity to opt out of it a part of the information booths. For reasons we never understood, the Cultural Bureau did not decide to censor this as it was considered part of biennial's infrastructure and not an exhibit. So I share that story with you because it underscores the way technology is being used for potentially authoritarian purposes, and that we need to understand those risks and employ a lot of creativity to fight them. It's obvious that the work of CPJ and the ACLU is even more relevant in 2020 than it was in recent past. While we might anticipate journalists covering wars or riots, might be the targets of doxing or other forms of online violence, we might not have expected that reporting on a pandemic would also be perilous. But incredibly, even that beat comes with considerable danger. As we might expect, the risks grow exponentially depending on where the reporting takes place, a reporter's race, gender, or sexual orientation. So first, we're going to hear from Courtney Radsch, whose organization is trying to mitigate those dangers in a whole host of ways. They provide journalists with risk assessment templates, courses to improve online safety, and workshops with names like How to Dox Yourself on the Internet, Online Harassment Field Manual, and Know Your Trolls. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to chat because I think you hit the nail on the head, which is, these threats have existed against journalists for quite a while, whether we're talking about hacking, spyware, surveillance, online harassment, threats, etc. And we're just seeing that they are compounded by the coronavirus pandemic. So I want to spend the next little while talking about kind of taking you through a whirlwind of some of these threats and issues that we're seeing around the world, both directly related to COVID-19 as well as just more broadly some of the existing threats that we see around the world. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and we will see what happens. So first I want to show you a slide from a map that we have. Let me see if I can make this. Is this working? Can everyone see that? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, I'm not sure how to get rid of this sidebar, but anyways, I have the full version of Acrobat. So essentially, the Committee to Protect Journalists has been tracking what we're calling 10 symptoms of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these include the 10 issues you see here on the map that include things like laws against fake news, suspending free speech, emergency measures, online censorship, blunt censorship, including internet shutdowns, restrictions on accessing websites. They include restrictions on access to information, both in the physical and digital realm, expulsions, visa restrictions, and of course, the dangers and hazards posed by surveillance and contact tracing. So if we think about what are some of the issues that we've seen with respect to legal restrictions on and the criminalization of journalism. So this was already something that we were seeing for a while. I want to try to see if I can make this go away. I don't know. Anyways, so we have seen this issue of the criminalization of journalism kind of pervasive for quite a while with the expansion of false news laws around the world, cybercrime legislation, social media laws that are essentially criminalizing many acts of journalism. But what we see with the coronavirus pandemic is that now we have health laws and disinformation laws that are given the veneer of legitimacy by the coronavirus pandemic and the very real infodemic that is accompanying it. And the real need to get information to the public that is accurate and obviously, journalists play a very important role in this. But what we're seeing is that through the adoption of new laws, the use of existing laws, and frankly, in a lot of cases, extra legal approaches, journalists are being caught in the crackdown. So we know that the pandemic has caused millions of people around the world to get sick and even die. And unfortunately, what we're also seeing with journalists is that they are also paying a price in terms of journalists who are in jail and can't socially distance or keep themselves safe, which has resulted in at least 2 deaths. We are continuing to track this. We anticipate there will probably be more because it amounts to a death sentence. And so we're really going to focus today on looking at some of the tech, where tech is intersecting with this. So we're seeing one of the issues that journalists are facing, again, that was existing in advance of this specific pandemic, but which continues to pose real challenges to the journalistic endeavor. And that is the issues of content moderation, restrictions on the internet, on websites, on social media. During the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen the suspension of media licenses. This has been for both online and offline media. And we're seeing that content moderation by platforms. I'm sorry, you'll probably hear the helicopter. I live in Washington, D.C., so sometimes it sounds a little bit like a war zone here. But we've seen that content moderation by tech platforms has become increasingly automated, and that after several years of kind of pushing back on the idea that they can moderate content on their platform, you know, the efforts to get them to deal with terrorist content, to deal with violent extremism online, or hate speech, et cetera, we actually saw them mobilize really quickly to address disinformation and misinformation. Well, that's had an impact on journalists. So we've, for example, seen that platforms have removed content, that they are implementing labels on, for example, state media or what they determine to be state affiliated media and journalists, that they are de-amplifying or restricting the circulation of certain content. And again, that this is being done in a way that is non-transparent and has a lack of accountability, because there's no real information about how those decisions are being made, what information or news sites are being affected. And of course, when we're trying to combat an infodemic, you want to make sure that journalism is making it through the social media filters, because journalism is how most people are getting their information about the coronavirus and how to keep themselves safe. We've also seen with this automation, you know, this movement towards automation, that the companies are getting together to coordinate on how they can be more effective in taking content down across platforms. So, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, we were concerned about this because with the efforts to combat violent extremism online and anti-terrorism efforts online, it has resulted in the removal of significant amounts of journalistic content, and it removes content that journalists rely on to report on issues that are really important and which you want an independent authority or some sort of independent expert talking about, not just relying on the government. So then we get to coronavirus and the importance, again, of the very real health concerns that come with coronavirus and the expansion of surveillance, of kind of the surveillance regime. And so we're very concerned about the expansion of surveillance capabilities and contact tracing and all of these apps that are being deployed around the world with insufficient safeguards for privacy, without sunset clauses or restrictions on how long that data can be held or used. And right now, we don't yet see it being deployed per se against journalists, but what we learned in the wake of 9/11 and the so-called war on terror is that a surveillance regime set up for one purpose can easily be deployed for other purposes. So we're watching with great concern as governments around the world have adopted pretty pervasive and invasive surveillance technologies to combat coronavirus, but which has resulted in the personal information of people being posted online, the ability to cross-reference data in order to pinpoint where people live, to do that contact tracing. Now, when you're a journalist, you depend on the anonymity of your sources, or at least the confidentiality of your sources. And so maintaining their privacy and their confidentiality is very important. And so we're watching what's happening with COVID surveillance tracking to see what happens with any sort of provisions for sunset clauses, restricting how long these can be used and for what purpose. We have reason to worry, because if we go to the next slide, we see that spying on journalists is unfortunately a pastime that many countries around the world, authoritarian and democratic alike, have deployed in order to target journalists. So journalists are in a very challenging situation in the contemporary environment, where they are increasingly reliant on digital technologies. Most of us are working from home. Even those who have to go out and report on the streets, of course, are depending on digital technologies, whether it's your mobile phone or your computer or internet, to get in touch with people. And that all means that they are susceptible to surveillance, spyware, and hacking. And we've actually heard from investigative journalists and journalists working on sensitive topics that they are increasingly concerned about their digital security for the precise reason that we have so many examples of journalists being targeted with surveillance technologies. One of the big developments we've seen over the past few years is the transition or the expansion of surveillance and spyware from being pull technologies to push technologies. What I mean by that is, in the past, you used to have to click on a link. You've probably heard of phishing with the PH, not an F, right? So phishing, where someone sends you an email or message, you click on a link, and all of a sudden you've got spyware installed on your computer. Well, what's new in the past couple of years and is the push technologies, where the network injection technologies, where they can actually send spyware just with your phone number or with an email address. And we saw this in the case of the United Arab Emirates with Raven. We have seen it in several other parts of the world. And this represents a real challenge because journalists can't remove their personal contact information very easily while remaining accessible to people, to their sources and to the public. And, we're in this this situation where journalists, there's this erosion of trust, and we want to open up the journalistic process and help people understand, the sausage making of journalism. And on the other hand, the more transparency you provide, the more you open yourself up to these potential attacks. So this push software, where you can push out hacking and spyware, is a real threat to journalists. We've seen it in Morocco. We saw, for example, that very sophisticated technology called Pegasus, which is developed by the NSO Group, Israeli-based, UK financing, has been deployed against journalists in Mexico, including journalists who were murdered, against Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist who was murdered by Saudi Arabia in the Turkish consulate, and against several other journalists around the world. Citizen Lab has done some really excellent documenting of this, and we've at CPJ have spoken to journalists who have experienced this and who talk about, how threatened they feel, because it's very difficult to keep yourself safe from network injection technologies. Now, of course, CPJ and other organizations like the Community to Protect Journalists are providing tools and resources for journalists to help keep themselves safe. But again, when all it takes is somebody having access to your phone number to send you spyware, it's really hard to think about how you can do that. So we also have to think about what policymakers can do to put on restrictions on how surveillance and spyware software and capabilities are sold to regimes and governments with poor human rights abuses. We are advocating for human rights impact assessments to be done in advance of selling those technologies to other governments. Because ultimately what happens is that this forces journalists to think and act like spies. So, instead of focusing on the stories and getting out the public interest, we see that journalists are having to think about how to be spies. So the problem with some the increasing challenge of these types of things is that it's hard to trace where this technology is coming from, whether it's being used, whether the phone running slow, or the weird echo on a phone call is due to a poor internet connection, which so many of us are experiencing these days, or whether it's due to a more nefarious thing like spyware. So luckily we have partners in this area like Citizen Lab, like others like Access Now, who are able to do some digital forensics to look into that. But again, that's a real challenge for journalists because a lot of them don't really have the capabilities to figure out what exactly is happening to their devices and how to keep themselves safe. And we have a real patchwork approach to legislation and restrictions, the regulatory framework that governs these sort of technologies. So in addition to the surveillance and hacking and spyware that we see have already been a problem for journalists over the past, I would say more than a decade, and really in the wake of September 11th, when we saw the mass surveillance technologies and the capabilities rolled out by the United States in companionship with their Five Eyes countries, setting a really negative a really negative precedent for how this can be deployed against journalists. And we've seen a real shift in the power dynamics between journalists and those in power, especially in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, when you saw that a lot of activists and journalists around the world were able to use these digital technologies to combat those in power and to speak truth to power, to report on human rights abuses and government abuses. But now there's the increasing sophistication of this spyware and hacking technologies that are being sold to these governments, who of course have much bigger budgets than journalists. I want to next go to, what happened? Let's see. So in addition to surveillance technologies, we're also looking at things like online harassment, which is kind of a general term that loses some of the import of really what constitutes online harassment. This includes things like death threats, rape threats, the sharing of personal information such as your home address or phone number, where your kids go to school. So we're seeing increasingly that online harassment is endemic to the practice of journalism, especially if you're a female journalist, if you are a Black journalist, if you are covering certain beats like white nationalism or corruption or human rights in certain contexts. And of course, if you have any sort of intersectionality in your identity. So we advise journalists that they need to anticipate online harassment, and that as part of their threat assessments and their risk analysis before taking on certain assignments, that you consider what is the risk of hacking and surveillance and online harassment, because most likely that will be part of your experience. And we have a lot of tools that journalists can use on our website to help look at how to mitigate some of these threats. But it's very hard to mitigate threats as an individual journalist or news organization when the online harassment is coming from political leaders, which is increasingly common. And you'll see here on the screen four leaders around the world who have really been at the forefront of online harassment campaigns and disinformation campaigns that in many cases target journalists and put them in the crosshairs. So in India, we've seen that journalists have been targeted with deep fake videos, including putting the face of a journalist on a pornographic video, which led to death threats to the extent that this one journalist, Rana Ayub, had to flee the country. We've seen in the Philippines with President Duterte, who has launched a massive campaign against Rappler, the independent news site there, and its CEO, Maria Ressa, who was actually one of the first journalists in the world to uncover information operations and the sophisticated manipulation of information and inclusion of online harassment as part of that approach back in 2016, before the election in the United States revealed so much of what Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and other groups were doing in this respect. She is actually still under threat. We check out Hold the Line. We have a whole coalition in support of her, but it is really challenging when you have the power of the state against you. Then we go to Brazil, where you have a president who has put journalists in his crosshairs, as inviting them to the presidential palace for briefings without wearing masks. And when we talk about online harassment, we've seen, for example, that when Jair Bolsonaro has targeted journalists like Patricio Melo Campo, who is a battle-worn journalist of more than 2 decades, war zones, conflict zones around the world, never had to have a bodyguard until she started getting these online threats and worrying about the safety of her son, and we're, getting followed to these events. And of course, we have our own president here, where we have documented, along with other groups, that when President Trump targets a journalist or a news outlet, then we see a rise in online harassment. When we talk about online harassment, there is an offline component in many cases. And that's the challenge, is when does online harassment and threats lead to offline violence? And when we talk about online and offline, there's no difference. Our lives are lived on and offline, but we have to really think about, when are these threats going to lead to physical surveillance or physical, they will follow these journalists around to their beats, to their homes, to their kids' school, or maybe show up on their door. So we have a lot of tools on our website. I just want to wrap up, advise you, if you're interested in learning more, you can go to cpj.org. We have our emergencies team that has developed a series of tools and digital security toolkits, how to protect your information online. But we do need to also call on tech platforms and governments to do more to create the terms of service and community standards and response mechanisms that will prevent this sort of harassment and threats, and the regulatory frameworks that will enable journalists to receive some sort of meaningful remedy without impinging on their journalism. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. I think you're still muted.
I knew I would forget to do that. I always forget to do that. Thank you so much. It was interesting and pretty scary. So I'd like to get us started off with maybe the conversation started with a question I had. I noticed you had a map of all of the threats around the world and the types of threats that journalists are facing. I'm really curious, how do you gather that data? What are your sources, and how do you know that those sources are reliable? Because I imagine that's a challenge too. I imagine governments are trying to suppress even that signal coming out. That so how is that done?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because it can be very challenging. So just like we are essentially at the Community Spec Journalist, we are also a news service where our beat is reporting on attacks on the press. So every day we're in touch with journalists around the world, with networks, with NGOs, with other news outlets that are reporting on this. And we are, just as with any other journalist using our sources, we have many people who will come to us, report on a journalist under threat, et cetera. But you raise a very important point. So Kashmir is like a great example where, we don't have anyone in the ground in Kashmir, although my colleague has been there several times. But when they shut down the internet and restricted mobile phone access, it became very hard to report on, everything, but especially press freedom violations, because no one could get any information out. Journalists couldn't do their basic jobs. With coronavirus, we saw the implementation of quarantines and lockdowns. In many cases, journalists were exempt from those, but you had to have a press card in some cases or have official accreditation, which most freelancers don't have. Or if you work in a country where the government kind of runs the union and provides accreditation, you might not have the right accreditation, so you can't get out. We are very dependent on digital technologies to be in touch with our sources. Signal, we use Signal a lot. We used to use WhatsApp, but that's a lot less secure. We're very careful about media, email, and all of that. Reporting in Iran is definitely a challenge. We use a lot of security, we all have training in how to securely communicate with our sources, but we, like every other journalist, are operating on, we have to verify the information we get. We double source everything. We make sure that we call the government, we call the police station, we call the regulator, whoever is on the kind of other side of the story, to get their perspective. And we document that in our reporting. So you'll see in our stories, for example, that will say, CPJ attempted to get in touch with the Moroccan regulator to find out whether they were using said, hacking technology against the journalist, and tried them via WhatsApp and Zoom and blah, blah, blah. And then, we'll document all of that. So, just using the tried and true journalistic methods.
I think, so hi all, I'm Daniel Gilmore with the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. And Courtney, thanks for raising all of these concerns, like giving them a broader airing. It's really, I'm very happy that CPJ is out there pushing on this. I think, Sam, your question also about how do we know that some of these things are happening? Some of these types of attacks on the press really are designed to be public, right? They're aimed to discourage journalists. So some of them don't need adequate sourcing. They just need in fact, the folks who are doing the attack want them to be public, because the publicity itself will deter journalists from reporting, right? And so, you don't need too much sourcing when you can get it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, for someone, for an organization to stand up and say, we're implementing this new set of laws or this new set of policies, or, we're taking a hard stand that, for example, the Five Eyes group published a document earlier this month, saying that end-to-end encryption basically is going to need to go. They don't want to see end-to-end encryption because it's problematic because of the usual suspects, which are terrorism and child pornography. But this is a battle that's been going on for years. But those things are a direct attack on journalists' ability to do their jobs, right? The underlying technologies that are there. Courtney mentioned Signal and WhatsApp as messaging systems that reporters use. Those tools use end-to-end encryption, and if the Five Eyes statement is to take effect, then those tools would not be available anymore, and that means that a journalist who was reporting on information that might make people in power uncomfortable would run the risk of exposing the contents of their communications with their sources.
Can you elaborate for some of our users and myself, what exactly is the Five Eyes statement you just mentioned?
Yeah, Courtney mentioned Five Eyes. So it's a coalition of English-speaking countries. It's a surveillance coalition, basically. Courtney, help me if I'm getting them wrong, but I believe it's the U.S. and the U.K. and Australia and Canada and New Zealand. There has been a intelligence sharing agreement between them for years, often their intelligence services will cooperate with each other. The folks who are operating these intelligence services see themselves as the good guys, and yet they still turn around and come out and make proclamations that are really dangerous, not only to people who operate within the countries that the Five Eyes are from, but these are the GCHQ and the NSA, that's the UK and the US, have their fingers all over the world. So it's the policies are dangerous for everyone, and they set a really bad precedent, right? If these guys are saying they're the good guys and they are the ones that are actually making life more difficult and more, making it more dangerous and more complicated to be an effective journalist, then you can only imagine the folks who don't have any qualms about trying to pretend to be the good guys who care about things like a free press. They can turn around and point and say, well, of course you shouldn't be having this end-to-end encrypted messaging. I mean, even the US and the UK say end-to-end encrypted messaging is bad. We're going to make that illegal, and we're going to punish you for using it, or to even just detect when you use it and put you on, make your life harder as a result.
Yeah, and we see that, we see that a lot in terms of the demonstration effect of US or UK or Europe and how that then proliferates around the world. And another, aspect of that, for example, are these content regulation laws that, for example, the NetzDG law in Germany, which outlaws and criminalizes the posting and sharing of certain types of content online, and imposes pretty significant fines on social media companies over a certain size if they fail to respond. So we see that this law has now gotten picked up in other parts of the world, like Turkey, which just passed a very, very restrictive version of that law. But I think, to go back to something you said, and Daniel, to build on that is, the governments need to only take a couple of journalists to send that message, right? You arrest the journalist, you detain them for, ostensibly breaking whatever this law is. On the other hand, the flip side of that is it's with the spyware and the surveillance, attribution is very difficult. That means determining who is behind it is very challenging, which then restricts our ability to report on it. Because if you're doing journalistic work and you want to make sure that you have your sourcing adequately, you need to be able to figure out, who's behind it. So it's interesting. Some types of attacks are designed to send a message. Others are much more nefarious and designed to kind of get under a reporter's skin without them even knowing.
Courtney, if I can just pick up on what you're saying, there's a whole range of different attacks that can happen on journalists, right? And we've mentioned things like an attack on end-to-end encryption. Sorry, you might hear a dog barking in the background, but she's friendly, I swear. So other issues for journalists as well, right? So, one example is device encryption, right? And you've mentioned this briefly in the slide, and I know that CPJ has good resources for journalists about how to keep their devices protected. But we see, we see the kinds of attacks that you're talking about, where as long as I've got your phone number, I can, hack your phone. It's also, as long as I can take your phone from your hand, I might be able to hack your phone, right? We see devices from Celebrite and Gray Key. And we see, again, law enforcement stepping up and saying, these are valuable tools. We want to make sure that we can retain them. And yet these tools, the hacking tools, the online hacking tools and the device hacking tools, these tools only work because there are bugs, because there are vulnerabilities in the tools that everyone, including the journalists, use. And we need to, if we fix those bugs, if the tech platforms fix the bugs that make the device and make the devices not susceptible, make the communications not susceptible, then then those tools become useless for the law enforcement purposes. And so you have this pretty tricky situation where law enforcement is actually pushing against the tooling that's necessary for journalists to be able to operate securely.
Right. Let me ask a slightly different topic. We've talked so much about high-tech tools here, encryption, push and pull attacks and all of this. Something that Ben and Nithya and I discussed in our class was the opposite, low-tech protection. For example, could we design public spaces that were surveillance-proof and things like that? So I'm kind of curious, do you guys have low-tech solutions for that you recommend, or is this really, that sounds like it's so much spy versus spy, high-tech stuff. Are there low-tech solutions that you consider as well?
I mean, I definitely think that the more complicated, and this is my personal opinion, but like the more complicated you make it, the less likely it is to get adopted. I've worked as a journalist in the Middle East in some pretty challenging countries and done a lot of digital security, workshops and things like that. And, for the most part, you don't need such complicated, technologies. I think it all goes back to your risk assessment, and you have to understand what your threat model is. But, if you're not reporting on government surveillance or corruption or, transnational terrorism, these sort of things, if you're reporting on healthcare, sports, or whatever, you want to understand what your threat model is, and then you want to adopt the right approaches. So this might mean, simple things like using two-factor authentication. So, you log in and you also have to, put in a code from another device or a YubiKey or something else, to authenticate yourself, or using a password manager, right? The days of using passwords where you change one number and you replace letters with numbers is very 1990s, and journalists should not be doing that, because there are some very basic things that are pretty low tech that they can do to keep themselves safe. I think there's a whole, we talked about kind of surveillance with respect to devices, but along with coronavirus, you're seeing things like heat mapping being rolled out in cities so that, they can catch people with fevers. You've got massive CCTV and other sort of facial recognition systems being rolled out in the United States. Obviously, the UK is known as having so many of those, and with very few protections, with very little oversight. I'm sure many of you have heard about Clearview AI. So I think we're not yet at the stage where we have very good solutions for that, because we don't even know the scope of the problem. We're only starting to, learn about a lot of these technologies. And I think that you can ask and you can advise journalists to take certain steps to keep themselves safe. Sometimes this means using a pen and paper. My colleague who went to Vietnam, who snuck in to go report on some independent bloggers there, didn't take a computer, didn't take a device, took some pen and paper and wrote in the margins of a newspaper, very low tech stuff. Maybe it's meeting in person, not really an option anymore. Maybe it's using PO boxes to communicate, but it's really going to depend ultimately on your threat assessment. We have these risk assessment templates that, reporters can use, anyone can use, to think about that. But we need to know more about how these technologies are being deployed, and we need regulatory oversight. We need our lawmakers to step up and put in place those restrictions on how that data can be used, how that data can be collected or aggregated.
I want to just to add to what Courtney was saying, you know, there's a set of like technical things maybe you can do. But if you're a journalist, you're not working alone, right? You're working with your other journalistic colleagues, but you're also working with your sources. And so you know, what you can do is going to be limited by what your sources can do, right? If your sources either can't install Signal or, you know, don't have a device or are worried about a different kind of surveillance than you also as a journalist need to be thinking about what your source's threat model is. And that can be very different, right? Somebody who is a whistleblower from within a large corporation may have a different threat model than your news organization normally has, and yet they may be the thing, the piece, they may be the source for the piece of information that really cracks open a big story. So, in addition to what do journalists need from law enforcement and from policymakers and from their own organizations, there's an overall social question about norm setting, about what is it reasonable to expect people to do. If you're a journalist and you have and you know, you publish how your sources can get in touch with you, right? So you might want to publish an email address, and yet you know that email is not very secure. You're doing that because you need a source, right? But there are some sources but maybe you should also be publishing how to contact me via more secure channels that reduce the amount of metadata that might leak, channels that are going to be end-to-end encrypted, and so forth. At the same time, as you cultivate a source, the source may not know that they're going to be the source of a bombshell story. You want to cultivate them as somebody who can give you background information. And yet, if they start off on the less secure channels, they're still creating digital trails and digital footprints that will link them to you, the journalist. And so that's an increasing challenge for journalists, because the overall norm in our society has not been one of taking information security and metadata protection and things like that seriously. And so if a journalist says, only contact me over the most top secret channels you can find, many sources are going to be like, I don't want to talk to that person. Like, I don't want to put myself in that you know, in the flight path of whatever crazy thing they're scared of, right? And so there's a difficult job for journalists to figure out there.
And even then, I mean, just to build on what you're saying, like you can have really secure forms of communication, but you may still be leaving a giant metadata trail. Or, you know, metadata is the you know, message, not the content of the message, but the information, like who was the message to, what time did you send it, or metadata in terms of your location. And that's why we go back to being real concerned about what is happening with coronavirus surveillance, because we know, for example, look at the case with Jim Risen, a former colleague from the New York Times, who was, you know, charged. Well, he was facing charges, and his source was ultimately convicted, not requiring Risen's testimony, but, you know, they pieced together a bunch of different little pieces of data, like, you know, looking at when people logged into things, where they were with their key card, et cetera. You know, we've got all of this geolocation data. Our cell phone is pinging these towers all the time. There are sophisticated law enforcement, you know, things that can kind of spoof cell phone towers in order to get these signals. So we are leaking data all the time. And, you know, I'm sure many of you got that pop-up from Apple or Google recently saying like, hey, download this COVID-19 contact tracing app. Or maybe it's not, it's one of the apps to, you know, to help combat COVID, which could have some real benefits. But if we don't have a huge layer of transparency overlaid to these restrictions on who gets access to that data, how long are they going to keep it, what can it be used for, and trust that they're going to abide by that, it's going to be really hard to see that implemented, because there's such a poor track record, and there is so much digital detritus that we're leaving around that in many cases, you know, in my personal opinion, we're getting to the point where it's going to be very difficult for a journalist to even promise, much less even, you know, entertain the idea that they can have confidential conversations with sources when you think about all of the various kind of digital traces that we're leaving around.
Yeah, that's a really motivating concern for me to do the kind of work that I'm doing at the ACLU, like as a technologist, is this idea that we are in the process of creating trails that could be used and could be used to sort of unwind, that gives sort of a God's eye view of who talks to who. Courtney, you raised the specter of these COVID-19 exposure notification apps, right, which people probably got requests for on their phones. There's a fascinating situation there where the engineers behind that exposure notification system thought long and hard and said, how do we make sure that these tools actually have technical safeguards on them so that they don't create the giant database of who's talking to who? Because we know that if we create that database, people will be scared of using them, right? But that same attention to detail that was put into these coronavirus exposure notification tools has not been applied to the overwhelming majority of the tech people use today. And of course, that means the overwhelming majority of tech that journalists use today, right? Like all of these systems depend on software update systems that themselves are capable of, the exposure notification systems themselves are actually pretty good as far as privacy preservation goes. Like I've looked into the details. We don't need to go into all of them now, but compared to other systems, there's a decent amount of privacy engineering that went into them. Whether they're effective or not at combating COVID is a separate question, but they're not too bad. But they all depend on software update systems that themselves are capable of tracking users, right? And if those systems can track users and two people go into the same spot, it would be possible to go back to the software update vendor and say, hey, show us who did updates, from this particular location at this particular time. This is the sort of metadata stitching that Courtney's talking about.
Charlie Wartzel of the New York Times did a great piece where they got access to a big data set from a mobile phone operator, and they were able to show that this idea that you can anonymize data, yeah, sure, you could theoretically take off, the information, but guess what? There are very few people who are going from this location to that location every day and meeting these people, and they actually figured out a lot of personal information and went and contacted some of the people that they de-anonymized from this one data set. So, we want to be really careful about that because, you could track all of the people coming and going from the Washington Post or, your local newspaper and where are they going. So we just, it really is, I think, a whole new world for journalists that we're only beginning to understand how to combat. And that's why, as Daniel said, we are all in this together. Like we can't be working alone because we have to depend on policymakers, on organizations like, the ACLU and all of the other organizations doing great jobs to protect our civil and political rights to make sure that we have the frameworks that enable a free press.
Yeah, and I saw a question in the chat that asked whether student journalists are being targeted with the same sorts of things as non-student journalists, and I would guess that probably most student journalists are not being targeted with the same level of firepower, but some of them could be. And certainly, if you're reporting, for example, on your campus on things that are happening on your campus, let's assume we go back to campuses at some point. If you're using the campus network administrators can probably figure out where your device is because your device uses Wi-Fi and it uses Wi-Fi in certain places. And if you think that you're giving your source, who's exposing, I don't know, let's say corruption in the local sports team or something like that, and you've got an anonymous source that you want to use to talk about that, if the administrators feel threatened by that story, they can go to IT and they can ask IT, where was this guy's device? Where was this woman's device? And then who was near that device at the same time? Let's go through them. Let's get a list of which of these people look like they would be plausible sources. So
or
these are
they
things
just
that
get access to your email because you're probably using, the educational server, and you should make sure you know what your privacy rights are. Most people working for an employer do not have a right to privacy on, employer-owned systems and networks.
Does CPJ or the ACLU, do you see that this this need for information security is making its way into the undergraduate journalism curriculum? Like, do you think this should be taught in school to undergraduates? I mean, are you making these tools available?
I mean, we're trying to get journalism schools to even teach safety as part of the journalism curriculum. So, you know, in the wake of the murder of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff in 2014 in Syria, I think that was a big wake-up call, and you saw the industry and organizations like ours coming together to try to create what we call a culture of safety in news organizations, filter that into journalism schools. So you are seeing more journalism schools having safety as part of the journalism curriculum, and that in some cases includes digital safety and digital security, but there's a long way to go. I think the James Foley Foundation, which a friend of mine is the executive director at, I think they have a program working with undergraduate courses, but you know, anything that's happening now is very nascent.
And I want to stress that this is not just something that needs to be in the journalism curriculum. I mean, yes, it does. And you know, as we've been talking about this, there's these social norms about how do we communicate with each other? Like, what do we expect to do? And journalists can't do this work on their own. You know, they're not just getting the information from other journalists. And even if we had all of the CPJ curriculum, you know, mandatory across all of the journalism schools, which would be great to see that happen, you know, the folks that they're talking to aren't going to have that training, and they aren't necessarily going to have access to the tools, and they're not going to necessarily be thinking about the additional concerns. And so we need social norms that this sort of protective, like mutually protective behavior is a useful thing. And we also need the folks who build these platforms to be thinking about these questions, to be thinking about how does this platform affect journalists' ability to get a story? How does it affect their ability to get a story out, right? I mean, you know, one example of this, Courtney mentioned Signal, which this is an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, right? And Signal has a mechanism on it called disappearing messages. And that's a tool that you can use to, it's not perfect. Obviously, if you send me a message and it's set with a disappearing message, it's supposed to go away in whatever time frame you set. Maybe it's a minute. But obviously, if you send it to me, I can still take a screenshot of it, or I can take a picture of it with another device, or I can, you know, write it down by hand, right? There's a lot of things I could do to bypass that. But the tool, the choice of the tool to build that system in helps to establish this norm that, you know, there are some conversations that let's just both of us have an agreement that we're not going to keep a digital record of it.
Except, so, can I say with the double-edged sword of that?
Sure, yes.
Because if you're a journalist, like that's great for when you're talking to your source, but what have we also seen happen is that government officials are using the same technologies and the disappearing messages to bypass records retention mandates and laws around retention of government communication, which means that it's then no longer accessible to journalists or the public. It's not FOIA-able, right? Accessible under the Freedom of Information Law. So, you know, I just, to answer one of the questions, you know, in the chat about the double-edged nature of end-to-end encryption, all of these technologies are a double-edged sword. They can be used for good, they can be used for bad. There are pros, there are cons. You know, yes, end-to-end encryption can facilitate terrorists and child pornographers, you know, talking to each other. But guess what? It was journalists like Lydia Cacho in Mexico who revealed a massive pedophile, you know, child trafficking ring, you know, because she was able to communicate securely with sources. So any technology has pros and cons. It's about how the people use them.
I had a question, Sam. Can I come in with a question? Yeah. So one thing in this class that we and this is this question is for both Courtney and Daniel. I have to say it's been moving, like listening to you, and very like frightening, to put it bluntly, and the threats to journalists, I think, are so affect us because we understand how they can be generalized to the wider public. And one of the things in our class that we studied was how technologies become ubiquitous and how they are maybe not well understood. And one thing about facial recognition, for instance, is that it uses machine learning to essentially learn how to recognize faces of thousands, maybe millions of faces. And when you ask the question like, well, how did these algorithms learn from these data sets, it's very clear that there wasn't necessarily consent by all these people to have their faces being used for these purposes. And so while you have technology like facial recognition being used in airports and streets and schools, shopping malls, it's quite possible that the faces that were learned to train the technology never opted in for that, that they never knew how they were going to be used. And I think that this issue of, and this is my question, is like, the threats are sometimes maybe you're aware of them, but what about the threats that are like ubiquitous and somehow we're not aware of? Like this issue reveals, in our class, it revealed the kind of, the underlying like incursions of our consent or our freedoms, was that basically the making of this technology, you were never given a choice to begin with, and in a way, until regulation catches up with that issue, like we're left with this, we're always left kind of one step behind. Like we only realize it kind of when it's too late, or when we have to like raise awareness of it. And I just wonder about that. Like, what are the threats? What are the threats that are maybe that are more ubiquitous, background, not quite directed at, like, say, producing a story or protecting an individual journalist, but rather that kind of underlie the mediums or the platforms, as you say, to begin with?
I think you definitely hit, one of them on the head, which is it's not that maybe that these data sets were created without consent. There were many examples, Clearview AI being chief among them. My understanding from the reporting I've read is that those were collected from social media platforms without the consent. I'm sure many of you have seen in recent years or recent maybe months, the little pop-up that says, allow cookies or not. That's as a result of the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. But how many people actually go through and like click off the cookies? Most people want to get access to the thing, so they just push okay. So it's, even what does consent mean in this day and age? And sometimes you have a constrained choice set. So you might not be able to not give consent. For example, my organization uses Google Mail, and our platforms that we use are Google. So I don't have the choice to not opt in to using that platform and all of the data that it is collecting on me, and undoubtedly coordinating with my personal profile. So, I think that what we really need to interrogate, philosophically and technologically and from a regulation perspective, what consent really means, and how one gives that in an era where it is so ubiquitous, where you don't have the time to read or the legal knowledge to read 5,000 pages of terms of service. And even if you did, you still have to use that technology. So, I definitely think that the facial recognition aspect is a big one. It's very hard to opt out of that. You go to the UK, you don't have a choice. You go to the Emirates, you don't have a choice. Here, you've got it deployed. I think the last article I read said that 500 police departments are using that. Stingrays, the cell phone spoof towers, you can't consent into, getting into that or not, having your data pinged against there. So I think it's becoming really challenging. And when you talk about machine learning, this is a whole other seminar, but, the biases that are built into that, and then how those are being used to perpetuate systems of structural inequality, racism, and all of that, which I'm sure is like a topic for another seminar.
Yeah, Courtney's right on here that consent is an extremely dubious notion for most of this stuff. And even the cases where people claim that there is some form of consent involved is usually not what anybody who's who's an ethical theorist would agree is actually consent. I mean, just to take Courtney's example, if I send Courtney an email, I'm not even using Google. I've made no agreements with Google. Even if you could argue that Courtney, by willingness to work for her employer, is using Google, she still gets a copy of my email. Google sees the email that I sent to Courtney, right? I didn't consent to Google there at all. And I think one of the big questions that we have is we have to look at the systems that are being deployed. It's not just facial recognition, right? There's gait recognition systems. There's the electronic surveillance from the mobile phone network. There's Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, sniffers. There's all kinds of stuff like that that exists and could be deployed. And most people are unaware of it because you have to be unaware of it, right? These tools are designed to work in the background. I don't want everyone to have to learn how the radio frequency spectrum is divided up in order to get their jobs done, right? Like, I want them to be doing the other things that they're doing. And our technology is too complicated for anybody to figure that out. So we really do need to look at what are the sort of policy questions overall. And these are questions that we have to address as a society, right? People will often ask me, what are the things that I can do as an individual, blah, 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 as an individual journalist, as an individual student, like, to make this thing better? And the answer is, here's some things you can do. Like, if you're a journalist, you should know how to use the Tor browser. But you as a journalist using the Tor browser doesn't solve all of these other problems. There really are social things that we have to address. And for questions like facial recognition, we have localities around the country right now in the US that are choosing to say law enforcement can't do this. They're implementing facial recognition bans for law enforcement. Now, you can't necessarily implement a facial recognition ban for all private agencies, but you can say this is off limits for law enforcement, and that removes one of the major threat actors. Again, that doesn't solve all the problems, but just the fact that those bans are existing now, that people have managed to get them across, shifts the public perception about whether these tools are acceptable or not, right? And I think we have a long way to go, but I really do think that collective action and policy transformations are going to be critical to doing this. And those policy transformations have to understand the nature of the technical challenges that we face, right? Those, Courtney mentioned the problems with bias in the data sets that are used for these facial recognition systems, right? There's going to be similar problems with this kind of bias in gate detection systems. There's going to be similar kinds of concerns with, the ways that we're going to do anomaly detection for network traffic, where let's catch the bad guy by seeing whose network traffic looks weird. Some people's network traffic is just going to look different than others, and are they going to end up, wrong-footed as a result of that? So it's going to require that we have policy actions that understand the technical details, and that we make sure that the technical systems, as they're being deployed, have these ideas in mind, and that we need to be able to change the ones that have already been deployed, that were deployed without thought, and try to figure out ways to roll some of them back, or transform them, roll them forward maybe into something that is more privacy preserving.
And I think, chief among those would be looking at, for example, the ad tech and the whole, infrastructure of the social media ecosystem that we've created, right? We've talked a lot about kind of like, technologies out there, but also one of the most, I think, challenging issues we're facing right now is what to do about, the design of these critical information platforms on which journalists depend, both to do their reporting, but also to disseminate their reporting, and the disinformation campaigns, propaganda campaign, targeting, and all of that, and how journalism competes in that ecosystem. It's very challenging, but those are, there are choices. It'll be interesting to see what happens at next week's hearing, with some of the tech titans, as it were. I know Twitter is going to be, Jack is going to be testifying before Congress. We just saw an antitrust case being brought against Google. But I think, one of the things we also need to see is for lawmakers to increase their understanding of technology. And one of the things that we want to help them do is to understand how these technologies, how these choices about platform design, et cetera, impact on journalists, on the media organizations, and on ultimately press freedom, which is a core First Amendment right.
If I may interject, so one of the things we discussed in our class was like resources and access to resources. So when we developed our counterattack against the facial recognition system, it takes a lot of resources, money, and time, and that might be a thing that only certain people, and we feared a future where only a small few might have access to those resources, and they might be able to evade facial recognition, where the rest of the society will be recognized in public and be tracked. So in journalism, is there like a barrier where you fear that like some journalists may have access to these resources and others may not? Or is there a way that we can make these resources more equitable amongst like all journalists?
I mean, definitely, most freelancers are going to be at a disadvantage because they don't have, for example, a news organization that can buy them burner phones or, provide the training that they need or whatever it is, or the, anti-doxing services, the kind of you probably hear them advertised as reputation management, but they can also be really useful for journalists to see what sort of personal information is out there. Those are expensive. So, freelancers, non-staff journalists, but even, journalism is a relatively low paid profession. Local journalists who are not working in, a capital city or in a Western country. I mean, there are all sorts of disparities in the journalistic field. I mean, when I used to live in Egypt, and many of the journalists who work there, they don't get paid unless they write an article. It's not, and even then they sometimes don't get paid. I think that's definitely endemic already to journalism, and it only perpetuates itself when it comes to looking at these kind of technologies and mitigation strategies.
Yeah, Nithi, I think you've hit on a really critical concern there. And I would be curious to hear from you, what are the sorts of resources that you found you needed just in doing this, facial recognition defeating system that you set up? Like what were the, like, was it funds? Was it time? Was it engineering background? Like what are the sorts of things that you needed, and how would you imagine mapping that onto an existing news organization?
I mean, for us, we try to use a lot of open source technology, and the counterattack itself, we try to, as Professor Keen mentioned earlier, implement low-tech solutions. So even the sticker was something that we could easily distribute. That wouldn't take a lot of resources. But then again, one of the biggest struggles we faced was that it essentially becomes a cat and mouse game, where one side is developing like a counterattack for the system, and then the other side learns how to like work against that. So that's honestly like an ongoing battle that is yet to be solved, or I don't know if it ever will, in terms of facial recognition. But
and you just hit on something very important. The little stickers, right? You can use anything for a sticker. It is cheap. Put that over your webcam. Put that over your phone cam, like very low tech, very inexpensive, accessible to all.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's another kind of resource which I think we don't really acknowledge as much. Like one of the questions I like to ask when people are first starting to think about these questions of what is this massive surveillance network actually doing? Like, how does my phone actually work? The question is like, when is your phone communicating with the nearest cell phone tower, right? Because that's an opportunity for surveillance, right? When it's communicating with the nearest cell phone tower. So the question is, when is it doing that? I think most people initial answer is, well, like obviously when I'm making a phone call or when I'm using the internet, but the answer is when it's on, right? And so as a journalist, you might need your phone to be on, right? And if you don't want to be tracked, you actually are going to have to turn the whole thing off, right? You need it on because you need to be able to get an incoming call. But if you don't want to be tracked, you have to turn the whole thing off. And so even just the fact of being offline is a type of resource that's unavailable to a lot of people today, particularly in professions that are, information and low latency information like journalism. So there's some really tough trade-offs there.
And I mean, going back to the tough trade-off and the double-edged sword, right? You turn off the location tracking. Well, again, it goes back to doing your risk assessment, right? If you're going out to report in Syria or, a wildfire or wherever where, you want somebody to know, maybe to be able to find out where you are or be able to track you. And maybe that getting lost or getting kidnapped or whatever is more of a risk than, surveillance for a nefarious purpose. So, I think we've talked a lot about like worst case scenarios, but ultimately for journalists, it needs to go back to what is your risk for the story that you're doing or the beat that you're covering, and how then do you mitigate, what is your threat environment for that? If you're covering wildfires in California, are you worried about government surveillance? Probably less so than if you want to make sure that you have, a radio to be able to communicate with somebody or whatever it is. So again, just when you're talking about journalism, you need to understand your risk and your threat environment.
Yeah, I would say, like, as Daniel mentioned, how people didn't know when their phone like connected to like a tower or not. I think even in developing our senior project, we faced like a lot of difficulty in explaining what we were doing in the first place. Like the whole idea that you can counterattack surveillance was like a difficult concept to explain, and how surveillance worked. And so I guess that's like another great way to like tackle these issues. For most part, it's just like, getting that information out there and explaining it.
When we had that, when our exhibit was up in Shenzhen, what was really interesting is we tried to really expose this notion that you're somehow registering with your system, because people don't even know that they're participating in the system. Once that idea clicked that they were participating and then had the choice to not participate, nobody wanted to be surveilled while they were walking through this exhibit. And so it kind of gave people this seed of an idea. Wait a second, surveillance is a choice that we're making as a society. And the more that we can do what you've been doing to expose all of these surveillance tactics, and the fact that we as a society are allowing these things, and that we can resist it, either physically resist it, but ultimately, by changing our society, by changing policies, by changing laws, I think is really what's critical.
I mean, I think one of the other things to think about as we're talking in the journalism context is that changing laws, there's a huge jurisdictional range out there, and not every journalist is covering stuff that stays within one legal jurisdiction. And so while we absolutely do, and even when I mentioned, the localities in the US that are banning facial recognition by law enforcement, they're banning it by local law enforcement. And maybe the next town over doesn't have the same ban. And maybe there's federal law enforcement officers that are there that are not influenced by these bans, right? And that's just within the US. So we need these policies. We need them to shift. We need norms to shift, and we need to understand the interconnected nature of the space that we're operating in today. It's an ongoing thing. I mean, Ethan, you said cat and mouse. It is definitely going to be cat and mouse, and it's going to be cat and mouse. I can't imagine it stopping. But at the same time, the frustration with cat and mouse shouldn't let you just throw your hands in the air and give up. It says, okay, what's the next step? Like, what are the things that we need to do?
Well, it's a little bit past 8:45. I think we should probably wrap it up, because there's a debate we all might want to watch, or maybe not, depending. But I would really like to thank Daniel and Courtney in particular for taking the time tonight to talk about this. I definitely learned a whole lot, and I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks to Nit for joining us and sharing their thoughts. And if you guys have any closing thoughts, or
I would just say, when it comes to norms, we do have choices, and we want, we don't want to have the surveillance system that China has, right? We don't want to get into that situation. So it does take that individual pushing back, the groups of employees pushing back, calling, getting in touch with your lawmakers, making choices about, how you consume and what products you use when you can. But I hope that we don't just throw our hands up in the air. I'm really excited to hear about, the projects that you guys have been working on. It's really interesting to see, a young generation putting their thoughts, efforts, and creativity into these types of projects. And so I'm leaving a seminar webinar for once with a little bit of hope. And usually, you know, talking about such challenging things can leave you a little bit depressed, but knowing that you guys are taking this on and thinking about really creative ways to combat some of these challenges is exciting. So thank you for that.
I just wanted to put a shout out to, I mean, not just the folks who are here in this call, but hopefully there are some other folks who are here who are attending this, or who watch it in the stream later, who are looking at technical work, who are engineers like Nithi, or who are policy folks, or who are journalists. And I want to encourage those folks to think about what kinds of collective action they can participate in to try to make these changes better, because you know, we need more people who understand the details of how this stuff happens to be able to push back against it effectively and to be able to communicate it clearly to the general public, who we also need to help push back against it. So, you know, you might want to look, and there's a local jurisdiction has a bill coming up that, you know, ban, like New York City right now, there's a bill that's the contact tracing information privacy that's sitting on the governor's desk in New York State. And the governor's not signing it right now, right? This is a bill that says, exactly as Courtney was describing earlier, we're gathering all this data for the pandemic. We understand the public health reasons for it. There's got to be safeguards on it. Why aren't we putting the safeguards in place? So if you live in a place where there are bills like this that are underway, think about, you know, pushing on those. If you're studying these kinds of systems, think about the systems that you're working on and how they might be implemented differently, and try to advocate for those changes. You know, I'm excited to see what we can come up with if we work together on it.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I think that wraps it up for the night. So thanks again. Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you.